The Smith Script Great Hammer Throwadin is a heavy-hitting, stance-breaking, self-healing build that can function well at melee and at ranged, and it's kind of uncomfortably fun to play. I'm almost annoyed with it. I really want to try the new weapon types, but I just keep coming back to the hammer. But let's get into things. Let's talk about what's bad. Weight. Despite the Smith Script Great Hammer being one of the lightest Great Hammers in the game with a weight of 9, only 2 are lighter at 8.5, we are using it alongside a Great Shield. I'm using the Golden Great Shield, which has a weight of 17, and I find it a nice resting place between weight and guard boost, but as a result, you're either putting a lot of points into endurance or dedicating a talisman slot to the Great Jar's arsenal. Thankfully, a lot of seals have 0 weight, worst case 1.5, but nonetheless, you're looking at probably at least 26 weight coming in from your weapon and shield, so it can make wearing heavier armors a bit more difficult. Range. Obviously, on some level, this has the best range of any Great Hammer in the game by like 10,000% because you can throw it, but it is worth noting, in melee it does have a fairly short reach. Expect to find yourself in situations where sometimes your guard counters are missing against really fast or small enemies. But now that we've got that out of the way, let's look at what's good. Thrown. Yeah, so you can throw the hammer, and it rules. I think it's the best of the Smith Script weapons by a large margin. It feels like it's got incredible range, minimal damage fall off, a deceptively fast use time on the running and uncharged R2s. The damage gain from a full charge isn't nothing, but it isn't huge, so unless I have the time and opportunity, I just usually go for a quick R2 press. The hitbox also seems to come up fairly high on your character model, so it does a good job of getting over small pieces of terrain or hitting enemies that are above you. And I'm not saying there isn't a place for a ranged weapon in this build, but I certainly don't have one equipped. Stance breaking. This is a great hammer. Colossal weapons aside, this is the king class of stance breaking weapons. Guard counters and fully charged R2s are the best way to break stance with this weapon, though jump R2s are also solid. Let's say a lot of our stance damage will come out of our Ash of War Savage Lion's Claw. And just to mention damage, it's a big hammer, and it hits hard. So what else? Unbuffable. So the Smith Script weapons are a bit unique in that they can't be buffed or infused with Ashes of War that give them a buff. So no Crag Blade, no Sacred Blade, and no Greases. This isn't really good or bad to me, it just means it's a really prime candidate for things like Flame Art, Sacred, Magic, Cold, or Occult infusions, because you can't buff those anyway. I'm using Flame Art since it scales with Faith, it's kind of thematic with the smithing theme, and beyond that it allows us to get the most out of Flame Grammy strength. Combat. Our main strategies are pretty simple. It can almost be a list you run down. If you can, you're going to open with a fully charged throw. If you still have the opportunity, we're going to throw in some running or uncharged throws, even just for some chip damage. Once they get close enough, you'll either start attacking like normal, block and do guard counters into a stance break critical, or go in with Savage Lion's Claw. On bosses, you're generally going to rely more heavily on the block counter critical and Savage Lion Claw, and just use throws when the boss gives you distance for some free damage. So, for anything I mention, I'll have links to the gear in the wiki in the description, just in case you haven't found it. Gear. We have the Smith Script Great Hammer. We'll need 20 strength, 10 dexterity, 11 intelligence, and faith to wield this bad boy. It really only scales meaningfully with strength before we infuse it, and for this build we generally use Flame Art, might use Sacred sometimes. Believe it or not, holy damage is good against some bosses. As a result, you don't gain a lot for two-handing it, which is kind of nice. You can really focus on the one-handed and shield moveset. For Ash of War, we use Savage Lion's Claw. It essentially lets you do a double Lion's Claw, and the second jump has an extra little tick of damage, which I find helps keep enemies in place. It hits very, very hard. It is fantastic. For our shield, we're using the Golden Great Shield. You'll need 34 strength to wield this. I think the look complements the hammer fairly well, and it'll serve you up guard counters on a Golden Great Shield. As for seals, I use either the Erdtree seal or the Claw Mark, depending on how your stats are going. If you're like me and you're really pumping faith, the Erdtree seal is going to be the way to go, but it has a high minimum at 40 faith. If you're just putting in enough faith to get your buffs in, go for the Claw Mark, which only needs 4 strength and 10 faith to wield. As for armor, you've got a lot of options. In all seriousness, you can go for whatever you want. I do want to call out, however, the Black Knife armor. This armor just gives you a permanent muffled footsteps, and it really lets you sneak up on a lot of enemies, and getting a fully charged throw off an enemy can either start you with a ton of damage, it can knock them off a ledge. It's very good, so I do recommend that armor. As for talismans, I have a different setup for exploration as well as boss fights. For exploration, I go with the Blessed Blue Dew for passive FP regeneration, Ancestral Spirit Horn for further FP restoration, Great Jar's Arsenal for medium rolls, and the Ritual Sword Talisman to increase damage. We have damage coming from a lot of different sources: regular attacks, throwing, charge attacks, spells. So rather than go into one of the specific talismans for damage, I like that this one covers them all more generally. Also, with our high FP regeneration, I find I almost never need to use a flask. I can almost always use Great Heal to keep myself at 100% health, and I don't really find myself running out of mana. For boss fights, we keep the Great Jar, but we'll switch to either Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander for increased damage on the Savage Lion's Claw, our main boss damage dealer, Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for increased stamina regeneration, and then as a default, I kind of like to run the best Pearl Drake talisman that you have, but you could also run a more specific defensive talisman if you're aware of the boss damage, because they all hit very hard. Spells. Alright, so I haven't finished the DLC, there's spells I haven't found, so I'm just going to stick to some absolute basics here that really help the build shine. You want to buff yourself with both Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow. Great buffs, use them before boss fights or tough fights. Flame Cleanse Me. I haven't seen a ton of Poison and Rot in the DLC so far, but I like to have this no matter what. Great Heal. This seems to be the sweet spot for healing efficiency, at least to me. Feel free to also take Urgent Heal if you want to really maximize efficiency when you have just a little bit of chip damage. And then I'd also take one of the Dragon Breath options or aspect of the Crucible Tail. We don't have a great amount of area of effect damage, so when you have a lot of little enemies, both of these spells can make a big difference. Attributes. So I'm not personally too concerned about level. My stats are just what they are. They're not optimal. To the right of them, I'm going to show the stats I would take if I was staying on 150. If you're building up from there, I would increase Faith to 80, start putting some more points into Strength, Vigor, Endurance, and probably a little more in Mind. My starting class is Confessor, so the values might need to change a little bit depending on your class's minimums. If you've liked the video, please consider giving it a like. I'd be thrilled if you added a comment, maybe make a bad joke or pun about throwing. And if you want to hear me talk about more Elden Ring builds in the future, consider subscribing too. I love it when the number goes up. Regardless, thanks for watching. Good luck.